just with a little bit of intros about who we are. Admittedly, I'm the Oregon interloper at this conference right now, as I'm currently at the Catlin Gable School in Portland, Oregon. I'm the head of the middle school there. And the reason why I'm here is Merissa and I worked together for 10 years at the Lakeside School, both teaching this course. And we put a lot of time, energy, and effort in thinking and into how do we make an inclusive history course for everybody? Or how do we strive to do that, as it's still an evolution and something in process. Prior to, I'm at Catlin Gable, was at Lakeside. Prior to that, I taught on the East Coast at a couple schools in the New England area, in the Boston area, Connecticut, and did my grad work out there. And so I'll pass it off to Merissa for her intro.
Thank you, Ted. So as Ted said, we were teaching partners for a decade. And then Ted broke up the act to join the ranks of the admin team, but it's okay. I'm still doing the boots on the ground work in the classroom, and just with a new teaching partner. Ted was saying this morning he's like, it's our course, and I was like, it's still our course. It's fine. He was like, I guess I can't call it that anymore. And I said, this is it's just an evolution. So since we presented at the Chelan conference, actually, we've grown a lot, and the curriculum has changed as well. So we've kind of moved through, I guess, starting with critical race theory, moving into, kind of the work of multicultural education and inclusive education, and then kind of more in the position of anti-racist education now at this point, or even abolitionist education. Which is a term that I recently adopted from Bettina Love, who's one of my favorite humans on the planet. So I think as we do this, it's important to be flexible. I think it's important to know that, sources are constantly sort of coming forward that will allow us to increase the inclusivity of the narratives. And I think the time has come for this to happen more on a mainstream level. I think when Ted and I started this, it was actually quite subversive in our classroom. And we kind of kept it on the DL for a while because we weren't sure how it would be received. And then we presented nationally, and our head of school happened to be in the room and was like, oh yeah, that's what we're doing. And I was like, okay, cool. Now we can kind of check that, box off the list and continue on. So I want to acknowledge we have a little more flexibility with our curriculum being an independent school. And looking at the Washington State standards, there's nothing prohibitive there that would make this not adaptable to Washington State history standards. Because it's really more of like a philosophy or a thematic framework than it is like a specific set of lessons or instructions. All right, so we will move on. The first thing we're going to do is actually solicit some input from you. And Ted introduced me to this little thing called a Mentimeter. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put up a little, I'm trying to figure out how to, okay, here we go. All right, I'm going to put up a little question here for you, the same one that you just saw on the screen. And if you would just go to this menti.com and use this code to enter this question, then this should populate with all of your responses.
Yep, an anonymous word cloud.
Ted, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, not right now.
All right, we'll give you a few minutes to think and type. Ted, I don't have to refresh this at all, do I?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Oh, this is so
I'll
fun.
put the code in the chat for those of you who maybe cannot see it.
Oh yeah, thanks, Ted. I've never done one of these before, so this is kind of exciting.
as more word cloud entries go in, theoretically, it is making the text again larger for those that are repeat words. It's not a perfect algorithm, but it gives us a nice visual.
So many of these are words that will come up in our presentation, which is not a surprise. It would be great too in the chat. I know many of you introduced yourselves, but also maybe sharing what your like content area is or what your role is in education, just so we can get a sense of like who's in the room and what your yeah, just what your area of focus is. Yeah, for the middle school.
Mm-hmm.
I teach 7th grade, by the way. That's my favorite age ever. People think I'm nuts, but I love it.
So it's interesting to note in the our little Wordle here, what the largest words are, what people are thinking. Knowledge, critical thinking, connection. I saw perspective somewhere in there. Context, understanding. A little harder for me to read some of the smaller ones on the Zoom screen, but highlighting some of those bigger ones. I mean, again, as Merissa said, these are things that we will talk a little bit about. I saw empowerment, I saw indoctrination in there. And so we're going to try to unpack a little bit of this as we go through our presentation.
Great, thank you. This is so interesting. Okay, I'm gonna pause here and just go back to our presentation.
And to frame kind of this question as Merissa pulls it up, we thought a lot about this question as we were designing our course, and much of our presentation will be talking about the evolution of our course and how we arrived to where where the course currently is. But it really, we started with this question kind of, well, why are we doing what we're doing? The why, always so important, and so what is the purpose of teaching American history? Why do we do it? We landed, as Merissa said early on this idea that, well, actually we need to kind of change what we have been doing, which was a pretty traditional survey course. And how do we then build in this inclusive piece? So.
Thank you. So in the words of one of my 7th grade students this year, we were doing a little work with the 1619 project, and this student said, there was actually a whole reflection that went around this, but my question was basically about the criticisms of the 1619 project, that it's like some kind of revisionist history, and what do you think about that? And his response was, by acknowledging the history which shaped the present, we can work toward a brighter future. We revise history not to condemn our present and past while fearing our future, but to heal the harm of the present caused by the past in the future. And I was just floored by this statement that he made in terms of its optimism and hope, and also acknowledgement of sort of the pain and suffering that American history also represents for many of our citizens. And so as we did some of this work, I think one of the things Ted and I used to encounter were a lot of questions about, like, how do you teach about race without like all this, without it being a blame and shame game. Whoops, sorry. I don't know why that just happened. And I think that we've kind of hit at a place where it's just like raising awareness or consciousness, and students are able to understand, I think in particular with this year that we've had, with the prominence of Black Lives Matter on the national stage, that there's a lot of work that needs to be done here, and they are ready to do it.
Yeah, and just another quote for us to frame kind of how we think about this. And this was an Arthur Ashe quote from the early 90s, but one we find applicable really to almost any decade, and obviously resonating today. The United States of America is your country. Some people will tell you it is theirs alone, not yours to share. Don't believe them. You must resist any group that believes it has a proprietary right to guide the ship of state. And these things really inspired us. These quotes from students as well as from well, historians as well as other people like Arthur Ashe, just in us thinking about how can we build this course? How can we make sure that we are really fulfilling the goals of a social studies education? That we're empowering students to think and make good decisions and be part of a culturally diverse or just a diverse population. Ultimately aim kind of for the greater good.
Okay, thank you, Ted. All right, so we are going to transition into breakout rooms for just a few minutes to give you an opportunity to talk with each other. And we would like you to discuss what does it mean to you to teach an inclusive curriculum. Ted, could you just put this question in the chat real quick so that it carries over to the breakout rooms?
Sure.
Otherwise, it does not. And then kind of how is this different than the classic survey course, which is what we started out teaching? Or is it different?
Okay, and I'm getting breakout rooms open. There should be about 4 or 5 of you at a time, and let me know when you want me to hit go. Merissa, I'm assuming you would not like to be in a breakout room?
Yeah, we can stay here. That's okay.
Okay, I will get you out here. Or you can just not join. How about you and Ted are welcome to join?
It's easier for you to do it that way.
Awesome. All righty, we're going to open up the rooms.
Marissa, looking at time as usual. So we're at 10:15. I think we'll be okay.
I think so too.
We probably won't be able to run them through the activity at the end, but
Let's see.
I think that's okay. We can talk to them about this, relate the activity back to the shame blame piece about setting up kind of, the conditions for negating that.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Unchong, would you mind just putting a message out to the breakout rooms, just saying, try to give everybody at least 1 minute to speak? Unless I can do that. I don't think I can.
No, you can't. Let me, because yeah, you don't have access. So try to give everyone at least 1 minute to share.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
All right.
Perfect. In the spirit of inclusion.
And then do you want me to give them a time warning as well?
Sure. My clock is, do you have 10:15? What does your clock say?
15 as well. Mm-hmm. If you cut into your Q&A time, that might be all right, especially if people are going to pop in with questions anyway.
Okay.
Just if you're really needing to get finished.
Oh, this is interesting. So this person, Jody, said, sounds like the book Stamped, which I just started using this year. We didn't have, it's literally right here. It didn't exist when we started this.
Did not. Wish it had.
It's so funny because Ted and I had talked about, like, neither one of us are writers really, and we were like, oh, it would be great if we could like just DJ together our own textbook, and then we're like, yeah. That's not gonna happen. So too busy teaching classes.
Right. Absolutely.
So
doing your day job.
And this obviously isn't, it's not a textbook, but it definitely, it's a great companion. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. So that's a great observation.
Right.
Okay. Oh yeah. So sorry. So you can close breakout rooms in maybe 3 minutes. What do you think, Ted?
I was going to say.
What's that?
It's funny. I was going to say like 2 minutes, but I don't know. Like, I didn't have the exact time that we started. So.
That's
I'll just say 2 minutes to wrap up. Or about.
Yeah, that's good. 2 minute warning. It's okay, Ted. We were only off by a minute. Oh. Okay, next up, agenda. Oh, I'm gonna edit.
Yeah, and so far I haven't seen any questions come up just yet, but folks are coming back. So folks are coming back early.
Oh, okay.
That's okay. We will close the room.
I just need to share my screen. Well, it looks like people are still talking. That's good.
Folks are rolling back in.
All right, great. Welcome back. I just wanted to highlight Jody from Tacoma said it sounds like the book's stamped, which we'll actually talk about a little bit later because I am actually currently using that book as a companion book in my classroom this year. So it was so nice to find it because I feel like we were looking for something like this for quite some time. Okay, Ted, I will turn it over to you.
Great. So we want to do a couple interactive things to start to get the brain cells going a little bit, thinking about inclusive teaching, inclusive curriculum. And here's kind of our agenda for the rest of the time. We already talked about who we are. We're going to do a little critical race theory overview, very high level. We have sources and resources posted on the WSCSS page, or kind of the resource page, and so you can dive into more information there. And so we're going to keep it relatively high level. So we'll kind of do an overview of critical race theory, talk about why it's important to us in terms of, from our lenses, specifically middle school development. What does it look like in our classes? We want to try to provide you with a tangible example a little bit, and then the big question that we're all still thinking about, how do we do this? How do we make our classrooms more inclusive? How do we make our history curriculums more inclusive? And we may have time to have more discussion about that at the end. If not, that's kind of the question we want to leave you with, and hopefully with some resources that you can walk away with and continue the thinking, the brainstorming, and the work that is so important in this realm. So back to you, Merissa.
Thank you. I would just like to say, normally we would have you report back out from your breakout groups and share what your thoughts are about inclusive teaching, but we're going to put a pin in that because just for the sake of time, we had to really crunch things down today. And then if we can do that later on, we will definitely do that. So 2020, fascinating year. We are, in a totally unprecedented time, with a pandemic, but also just in terms of, even with our history curriculum. So, Time put out this article after President Trump issued a declaration or an executive order stating that all federal entities were going to have to cease and desist teaching anything related to critical race theory, including their diversity and anti-bias trainings. And so this was something that I kind of whipped my head around a bit because this was the framework that Ted and I felt from the very beginning helped us to craft a course that was more inclusive. And so this to me felt like a lot of just fear, not really, a willingness to have any accountability as a white person in terms of what was, needing to happen in order to heal the damage from our past. And so I won't, go too far into it, except that I think this quote is really interesting, that he thinks it's racist. And, there are all sorts of, questionable comments that have been made, but this is something that I thought was really fascinating. And then, even more, perhaps even more, I don't know, of an issue for me was the statements that it's anti-American, that it's like a cancer. And when when these news articles came out, I was actually really, really concerned about, where the direction of the social studies was going to go in response to this, but was reassured by the fact that the education department functions separately. So this didn't really have anything to do with education per se, but it seemed to set a certain tone coming from this administration.
Yeah, and we really believe that, erasure of whether you want to talk about the framework critical race theory or any part of anybody's history, experience, or story, I mean, that really is a false narrative. That does not paint a full picture of the history of a country, of a people, of a society, and we will flat out say it's not patriotic, I think. And as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't jive with the NCSS, National Council for Social Studies, purpose of a social studies education, to again have informed, reasoned decisions for the public good as citizens of a culturally diverse and democratic society. So we truly strongly believe that critical race theory is one of the tools, and the one that we chose, that can really help make an inclusive course. And so, Merissa, if you can go to the next slide. So just a quick primer, I guess, or overview of critical race theory. For those of you, some of you may be very familiar with it, some of you maybe not as much. So here's some kind of groundwork or some foundation. It actually started in the legal realm, in law, with this guy Derek Bell, and he talked about the intersection of race, power, and law. And over time, other scholars and academics kind of developed different frameworks, and one of them was for education. And so Merissa and I did a lot of reading from different people, from Gladstone Billings, from Banks and Banks, a whole number of people about critical race theory in education. And it wasn't until we found this book by Prentice Chandler, which is Doing Race and Social Studies. We want to highlight this one because it really spoke to us. And you can find this in multiple places, but really the central tenets of critical race theory in education are these bullet points listed here. That, as educators, we need to create kind of a course, a curriculum where racism is seen as, quote, normal. And we don't mean that it should happen, that type of thing. It's more that racism exists. Yeah. It is part of our society, it's part of our world. And we need to kind of normalize that fact. We have to kind of fight against maybe a little bit of the color blindness that used to exist. Other tenet, race is a social construction, as well as the idea of, we talked about kind of historical context, revisionism, whose history is it, who gets to write the history, and in particular using then narratives and counter narratives as a way to balance out history, that we have a majoritarian dominant narrative. So how do we fill that in, or how do we combat that, or even how do we make that less of the dominant piece and bring in more stories and more voices? And I think that's a really crucial piece too, as we think a little bit about positive identity development in our students. How can we use more stories? How can we have positive representations of diverse groups in our history, instead of kind of maybe these monolithic or tropes or stereotypes of different groups? And that also gets the last 2 points of, acknowledging intersectionality and then acknowledging anti-essentialism, which is basically kind of the idea that, you have oppressed and marginalized groups, but within that group, people still have different needs. That it's just not, avoid the generalizations, avoid the monolithic kind of representations of groups. And so we use this as a framework for us to think about, how do we develop our curriculum? So how can we get students in a place where they see these 6, tenets or these pillars of critical race theory, and how do we build them and get them into a mindset where they're open enough to think about this?
Thank you, Ted. Yeah, this was one of those moments. I think it was just me. I saw Prentice Chandler at NCSS presenting with a panel of authors, because this book is actually, he edited the book and wrote some of it, but it was, there was a whole bunch of different contributions from other people, but I brought it back and I was like, Ted, this is what we're doing. This is kind of the direction that we've been going. And this kind of gives us an anchor to kind of build our course on. So we kind of went from there, and kind of back to Ted's first point, racism as normal, like it's the rule, not the exception. And I think that that's the thing that kind of going on to our next quote by Peggy McIntosh, I really needed to learn as a white person. You know, I live this life that's different than my colleagues of color and my students of color. And I need to be aware of that, name that, and be able to talk about that. And, you know, Peggy's comment was basically that she just didn't see herself as a racist or even participating in any racist systems, because she was taught racism was only an individual acts of meanness by members of my group, never in invisible systems conferring unsought racial dominance on my group from birth. And I think it's kind of odd, but I had an aha moment about this when I had a couple of stockbrokers come into my class and talk about, we were doing the stock market simulation. It seems completely unrelated. However, they explained compounding interest, which is actually a concept I hadn't studied previously. And I was like, oh, that's what privilege is. It's compounding interest, actually. And I think it seemed, I don't know, I guess we kind of, or at least I feel like I started looking at race and racism in US history as sort of the story of oppression rather than the story of privilege, and not really putting those two things in tandem. And doing that was part of the evolution of our course. Like, I think Ted, you know, remember we used to have conversations about this where like I would talk about whiteness in my classroom and Ted was like, I don't know if I'm going to go there at this point, you know, yet. And it still seemed like risky to introduce whiteness as a race, but keeping whiteness unracialized keeps it as the norm and keeps it as, you know, the default. So Ted, you know, we were talking about this yesterday, is an Asian American and I'm just an American. How does that work? That works because we don't talk about whiteness, and whiteness is the norm. Whiteness has been elevated in our society systemically from, you know, the time of colonial Virginia. So what we would like for you to do right now in the chat is just take a minute to fill in the blank for yourself. Like, if we look at our own history of the United States without a focus on race and whiteness, it is what? Try to keep it clean, people. So we'll give you a few minutes to respond to that. These are a lot of these things: incomplete, rose-colored, ahistorical, incomplete and supremacist, an illusion, damaging to our students. All of these things are things my students have said, because I ask them this same question. Things are missing: a day without Howard Zinn, fable, crippling and dangerous to my children, fiction, exclusive, exclusion. And then there were a couple from the beginning: a fragment of the truth, oppression. Thank you. Not history. It's a good brainwashing. Yeah, and it normalizes this idea that white is right, which, you know, unfortunately our education has done for a long time.
Yeah, and so just building on that, you know, we love this quote because it encapsulates kind of how we're thinking about it too. Just diverse groups, including whites, are missing in interaction. You know, that if we don't have them in the curriculum, you know, diverse groups, you know, meaningful representations, you know, it really, as you all said in the chat, I mean, it's not the full story. It's exclusive. It just doesn't paint a full picture, and it's not doing our students any service to preparing them for the world that they're going to enter in. So I think, you know, what we'll do now, just looking at time, we're going to get into a little bit of kind of the evolution of our course, and we'll do it kind of briefly, just so you get a sense of kind of how we went about it. And then we'll try to get a tangible example of what it looks like in the classroom. So,
thank you. Okay. So back when we felt like we really had to justify why we needed to do this, we kind of spent some time talking about windows and mirrors for students, which if that's not something that you're familiar with, there's a lot of research that's gone into looking at how students really need to see themselves reflected in the curriculum. It seems like a no-brainer for us now, but that was really the motivation, was keeping the students at the center. And our school is 50% students of color plus. So if we're going to center our students, which students are we going to center? How does that look? How does that work? And what students were already being centered by the curriculum that was being taught when we inherited it and when we were teaching it. So moving on from there, just like Ted said, for the sake of time, I just looked and realized how late it was. We decided that we were still going to teach American history or US history chronologically, but we decided we needed to like cut the fat, so to speak, and really anchor it in some kind of a theme. Ted?
Yeah, the theme we ended up on was the American Dream, and we loved this theme, and we still do, because it can, you can talk about the flip side, which is the American Nightmare, and you can kind of get into some of those areas that maybe a survey course doesn't present, a holistic picture of. So we framed it with questions such as, who gets to define the American dream? Who are the we and the we the people, excuse me. And it opened up really great discussions and got students really thinking about this concept that, uniquely American, and it allowed us to really kind of talk about the evolution of the American dream over time too, from kind of the start of kind of our nation to now, and look at how it's expanded and shrunk for groups of people. And so we found that theme worked well. It also became kind of an umbrella theme for other kind of substrands such as justice for all and equity. So it worked for us, and it's so far withstood the test of time.
Yeah, it's been in use for probably, I think, 10 years now. And my current teaching partner was like, well, I think maybe we should change it. And then, and we talked about a bunch of different options and we decided not to. So it's still happening. And I actually took one of these expressions from him, westward expansion versus westward displacement. I couldn't ever remember what it was that he said, but age of exploration versus age of exploitation, it's a yes and situation because there are multiple perspectives, and due to the lack of the written word coming from some of the perspectives, our history has trended toward being very Eurocentric as a result. And written history is kind of the only history that ended up in our textbooks. And so as we're thinking about things, I think at the very core is just trying to wrap in as many points of view as possible. So Ted gave you some of the essential questions that we use to anchor our course. Like, what is the cost of quote unquote progress? Usually I put that in quotes. And I think even just looking at how the land was acquired is a really interesting story from start to finish, and like who's entitled to it. We talk a lot about like language and why do we use the term like enslaved people instead of slaves, various different kinds of questions like that just support this idea of critical race theory. I just, as a quick side note, I just recently read Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent by Isabel Wilkerson. Excellent resource. She's like, it's not about race, it's about caste in America. And so she kind of pulls all of that together in a very, very compelling way. I would highly recommend reading that. Okay, so just as an example of how what this looks like in our class, we're going to give you one example of our intro to our westward expansion, westward displacement unit. And Ted will explain, kind of the philosophy behind why we would begin this way.
Yeah, this is a protocol that we used actually usually on the first day of class even to set the tone. And to go back to, I think, what Merissa said earlier about the shame and blame kind of feeling about history and how people are feeling about it. We always wanted to combat that and find a way that how do we create a space that builds a culture and the mindsets in these students so that they can engage in these dialogues, that they can engage in this discussion, and maybe they feel some guilt, but how do they move through that and feel empowered then to be able to, work through it, but also, work with the diverse opinions that will come up in class. So we love this protocol. It's been used in multiple places. The place we found it from was Project Zero from Harvard. And it's sometimes it's called See, Think, Wonder. We inserted a empathy step after we saw somebody else do it. So see, feel, think, wonder. And the purpose of it really is just to brainstorm really to build, again, the diverse thinking, hearing multiple perspectives. There's a lot of research from the business world out there that a diverse community will outperform a homogenous community, majority of the time. So we really want to build on kind of building multiple perspectives, providing windows and mirrors also through this, working on critical thinking, and also slowing down that thinking process so that we get students to be able to pause and, in a very kind of social studies historical skill set here, how do you build a hypothesis based upon observations and data? And then also be able to kind of then, most importantly, ask questions. So the steps of protocol, we won't have a chance to actually do this with you. We would normally do that in our normal 90-minute presentation, but we'll just walk you through it a little bit. So first you'd have students come up with initial observations and without judgment or inferences. So you say, I see a person sitting. You wouldn't say, I see a person sitting and I think they're doing this, because we don't know that yet. You're just observing. After you do that round, you kind of create a little empathy and you select that person in the chair who you see in the image and say, oh, based on what I'm seeing, I think they're feeling this way. Next step after that round is about hypotheses. Try to put the bigger picture together based on the data and kind of create a hypothesis about what's the message of the author, what's going on in the image potentially. And then last but not least, the question. So Merissa, if you go to the next slide, the example we would do to open up our westward displacement or expansion unit was this. It's those of you may recognize it. It's a Gast image, the author or the painter Gast, and we'd have students walk through this. So we'd say, well, what do you observe? And they'd start to say, what do you see? And they'd say, oh, I see some images of some people on the left side of the screen, and I see that it's darker on the left, whereas on the right it is lighter. And then we ask them, for example, well, what about feeling? What do you think that person is feeling? And then they'd highlight one of those people and say, well, I think based on that, approximately fifth person on the left, the way they're looking over their shoulder, it looks like they might be feeling fear because they're running away. And what is their message to this image? And they'd say, well, based on what I see, it's light on the right and dark on the left, I think there's an implied message about what is good and what is, quote, turbulent, or the good versus evil paradigm of light and dark that they use in images. And then we ask them to come up with questions. After we do this, we would then kind of reveal to them the author, the time period it was made, and kind of answers to some of their questions. And what we find that this does is it opens up discussion. It slows down their thinking process. It engages them in conversation, and then they can really critically dissect an image or a text even like this. And we can engage them in some of those questions about, well, what does it mean if this was a representation of the way people were viewing expansion or displacement? How does this relate to this idea of the American dream, and whose dream are we seeing this through? What lens is this through? And so it's a pretty powerful protocol. I would suggest you trying it out if you haven't already. And I'll pause there, noticing our time. Marissa, anything to add to this?
No, I mean, this really generates a lot of conversation with the students. And I just think back to the idea of, inclusion, there's a really low barrier to entry with students having the option to just do C, their observations and not maybe take the risk of doing a hypothetical analysis of, what the metaphor of this whole thing is. And I like that because from the very first day, it's really important to us that we get the kids used to speaking out in the class as a value add to the whole community. And just kind of, I don't know, I think the white savior complex thing is something that comes up with this. She's got a little star on her forehead. That represents liberty. So like, whose liberty, what liberty, all of those things. There are so many little details in here that just make it a really rich conversation. This image is, there we go, American Progress by John Gast. Yeah. And okay, I think we were going to do another breakout room, but we don't have time, so we aren't going to do that. And we'll just skip straight to questions. We do have, I put in the chat, but we uploaded this this whole presentation with some of the slides that we used in a longer presentation hidden, so that you can actually still see some of that content. And then, you know, we've got things like sources and other kinds of content that we didn't have time for. Ooh, I should leave it here.
I'll just note, I think one thing to know about our evolution of this course was, you know, we found the framework from Chandler and Banks and Gladson Billings, and we realized that we were doing a lot of these things already in our class. And so what was really helpful for us is that it wasn't a total reinvention of the wheel. You know, it was really more that we now had a framework to anchor this in, and we had the kind of research and the literature to back it up, to say, well, actually, you know, here's a little extra oomph to us to be able to say to our department head, as well as, you know, our administration, you know, this is why we're doing this. You know, we have more evidence here now about the positive impacts that it's having on students, and their sense of who they are as citizens, and to provide a more equitable and inclusive experience. So.
All right. So I'm just going to pause this there for a quick one. Thank you, Merissa and Ted, for this presentation. I think it's brought up a lot of, I think, great points, some good places to, again, do our own wondering and then apply it to our classrooms. I know that there are, in fact, a lot of questions even on the chat. I think if it's okay, Merissa, with you and Ted, what I could do is actually create a breakout room with everyone who has some follow-up questions, if that works for you. And that way you all can kind of, and for those who need to sort of take off or take a break, you can feel free to, because we are at that about 10:45 mark. Does that work?
Yeah, and while you're doing that, I'm just going to answer Jeff's question. So we use 1491 as a starting date, but we actually talk about the Inca and the Aztec. We use a little bit of guns, germs, and steel at the beginning, as we talk a little bit about distribution of resources and how it was the Europeans that arrived in the Western Hemisphere and not the other way around. So we definitely start there. And there's actually an activity in the Word document that we uploaded where we do all of this like background work on the existence of indigenous tribal communities in the United States prior to the arrival of the Europeans. And then we look at what the impact was, obviously with disease. And moving on, we show a little clip from America, the Story of Us, which is the History Channel's, like our kids call it the epic movie documentary. And it's like an eagle flying over the United States, and there's literally nothing there except for 60 million bison that you see at the very end. And just that contrast where the kids are like, wait a minute, we know that there were people here. We know that there was, like, what is this? And from the very beginning, then it like embeds that idea of like having to really interrogate your sources and question perspective and all of that stuff. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to do a quick logistics thing. If you go to our website, the WSCSS Fall Conference page, Merissa and Ted have been so generous to just kind of put everything for this presentation there, so you can all access it that way through the website. I did put the URL for our website, but you can certainly just do a Google search as well. I'm going to go ahead and open up that breakout room because our next presenter is also in the waiting room. I want to make sure that she gets an opportunity to get set up. For those of you who are exiting here, thank you very much for joining us. If you'd like to continue this look at U.S. history through sort of particularly the African-American histories narrative and lens, then feel free to come back into the room as well. But otherwise, thank you so much to Merissa and Ted. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Let me open up that breakout room for those of you who have more questions. So thank you.
Rob, I think you mentioned this. This is what I'm reading right now. So thank you for that.
Awesome. All right. So you can either exit the session, folks, or you are welcome to join the breakout room. And even if you plan to be here for the second session, I'm going to ask you to exit for just a moment so we can have our next presenter get set up and ready. Thank you so much, everybody.